After I finished at Duke, I thought, well, am I going to have a future in research or, in international development work? Am I going to work in an American city or work abroad? And I was trying to figure that out, like a lot of people who are 22, 23 are trying to do. And, I say to my students, and including undergraduates, go off and find out. Don't try to answer that right when you're 22. I didn't. I went from Duke to the University of Pittsburgh, and then to Haiti, and then I went back to Brooklyn, and so I had, in that year after college, I got to try a lot of things and see where I might be most comfortable casting my lot as a physician. As I said, I knew I wanted to be a physician, and I applied to Harvard Medical School and one other medical school because I was interested in medical anthropology, which is a very arcane little field. It's a narrow strip of scholarly interest in medicine and public health. And so I really wanted to go to Harvard because there were people there I wanted to work with. And I got that letter when I was in Haiti, in the middle of Central Plateau, which is where I still am working to this day. I thought, it'd be great to learn how to speak Haitian Creole, and it would be very handy to be, if you're a doctor in the United States on the Eastern Seaboard, it'd be good to know Spanish, it'd be good to know Haitian. It wasn't my intention to, spend a quarter of a century there. I'm headed back there from here, so it's going to be more than a quarter of a century. And I think it was the right thing not to have a set plan. I mean, I say this to students all the time. Why should you know what you're going to do when you're 22 or 23 years old? You got to allow yourself to be open to new experiences and to keep on learning all the way. I wouldn't have put it that way, although other people, did. There's a lot of. Are Haitians really resigned, or are they accurate observers of their possibility? I think back then, at that particular point in time, say 1983, 84, you go into a place and everything is always dynamic and changing. That doesn't mean you can see it. It doesn't mean, so since we're doing this interview in South Africa, I don't know what it felt to be in South Africa in the 80s. And there are people right here in this room who do. But I know that going into Haiti and at that time, it wasn't clear to me how much things were changing and about to change. So I think people go into Haiti, Americans or people from Europe, and they would say, oh, well, the poor are, resigned to their fates. I might have said that when I was 24, but I learned a lot later on that they weren't resigned to their fates, that they really, there was a power to organize and push for, real democratic engagement. It was very inspiring to me. So if I said that in 1984, when I was 24 years old, that they were resigned, that would have, I think, been an error. And I may have said it, but that would have been wrong. But then again, you learn things, you keep staying engaged. I wouldn't have thought, for example, that the country of Rwanda could make so much progress in the decade following the genocide in 1994, and yet they have. It's stable, orderly, growing, the economy's prospering, there's a commitment to social services like health and education. I don't think that anyone there in 1995, for example, would have predicted that. So I think it's wise to be humble about what's happening in the dynamic of a place. But I may have said that when I was 24. I hope not, but I'll have to look back and see if I did. I went to clinics, I went to mobile clinics, I went to rally posts, I went to hospitals, I went to well-known hospitals, less well-known hospitals. And, it was an eye-opener. It was just very disturbing, the quality. And then some of them are well-funded, some of them are underfunded, some of them were well-managed. But it really was, I understood how much the odds are stacked against poor people in that year. That was the, again, looking back, following the lines of your interview, in university, in college, you can read about all these things, and I think it's really important to do that. But when you can draw on a lot of reading and study and hard work about a place, say Haiti, for example, and then you head off to that place and actually experience it, then you have a whole different level of learning and experience. And that's what happened to me, is I'd read about it and I'd try to do due diligence and be assiduous in reading, but then to see it in all these different settings, as I said, clinic, rally post, hospital, it was very mediocre for, poor people at best. So that was the general experience, is wow, the quality of services, even those set up by people of goodwill. Some of them I still work with today. They still were lousy medical services. And it's hard to say that. It's not fun to, and I wouldn't want, maybe this is some advice too for the people who might look at a video like this, is it's very easy to criticize projects like this. It's very easy to go in as a privileged person, from, say, American University, and go in and say, wow, this is really poor quality care or very poor quality services. That may be true, and it's easy to say, but it's not always the best way to engage. And so what I tried to do is to stay engaged, in spite of the fact that the quality of services was terrible. So that diagnosis is easy. Then what is the prescription? What do you do to really engage, to improve things? And, one of the things that I can look back at with some pride and say is, well, at least we stuck with it. So 25 years later, we're still trying to improve and expand. Still have a long way to go. But that's the trick, is, persistence, staying engaged. People say to me, well, what's the secret? I would say that's the real secret, is it's not always a big idea or some innovation. And I'll make this point tonight in my remarks, because sometimes what's innovative and what's entrepreneurial is just staying engaged with something that's difficult. Just sticking with a tough problem. There are people in this country, for example, who are, say, providing medical services in townships. If they're looking for some magic recipe to radically improve health outcomes, they're not going to find them. It's really persistent engagement and fighting for basic services like electricity and water and housing and primary health care. And that's, what they call in medicine, they call that scut work. That's just drudgery. But the real innovation, sometimes it's just sticking with it. If you start in a squatter settlement, if you start up in a place like Conge, there's no school. And there was the beginnings of a school when I got there. There was a school, but initially that school was outside under a mango tree with, banana thatched roof. So that wasn't considered a worthy school. I was working with this Episcopal priest. I still work with him now, all these years later. So there wasn't a modern school. There wasn't a clinic. There wasn't a hospital. There wasn't water. There wasn't electricity. There wasn't primary health care. There wasn't community health workers. There weren't trained teachers. So all those things would fit in and there weren't jobs. That's another, people need jobs, as I was saying earlier. You talked about disempowering a community. And, that word empowerment has been much abused. People misuse it all the time. To me, I would use it the way you did, is that people need jobs and livelihoods to be empowered, to be able to take care of themselves. So in that particular setting, as in much of rural Haiti, everything remained to be done. There was no clinic. But remember, I'd already been to many clinics and hospitals that were terrible. And so that wasn't a good model. What I saw was not inspiring. And I later, it took me many years to understand. And remember, this is not me. You're asking me about my story, but I work with, first scores and then hundreds and then eventually thousands of people in Haiti, almost all of them Haitians. And the initial community health workers who we recruited and trained together in 1984, they're all still working together. We still work together. It's hard to have a blood bank without blood. It's hard to have a blood bank without electricity and lab techs, et cetera. But, then you again, it's easy to make that diagnosis and easy to rail against institutions, including the Red Cross. But it's much better to start working with them to build blood banks, and that takes a lot of time. But it's certainly not impossible. I mean, you can put someone on the moon. We can certainly put in better blood banking, and that did happen. But I think it happens again with persistence. It's not some innovation or the really entrepreneurial thing. This is a point I'll make tonight in my comments. The really entrepreneurial thing sometimes is just to stick it out and serve the poor. And then you learn things. Now, you don't want to keep reinventing the wheel. So if we learn something in Haiti that's useful in Boston, we need to make sure and share that information. If we learn something in Rwanda that's useful in Haiti, we need to get it back there. And that's another problem, I think, in development work and NGO work, is there's a lack of coordination and sharing of information and experience. But again, these are not problems that are insuperable. That's why you guys have your website, so you can reach out to lots of people who you're not actually ever going to meet. We need to harness those technologies as well. But anyway, I skipped ahead. But the bottom line was, as in many places in the world, you go to some place and these basic infrastructure needs are unmet. They're the basic services. What are basic services that everybody agrees on? School, water, food security, medical care. Most people agree on those. As if you're going to live in the 20th century, or to say nothing of the 21st, you need those kind of basics. And you have to build them. It's still an evolving kind of understanding. I'll tell you what I mean. So when I was 23 and went to the squatter settlement that was formed when the valley was flooded by a hydroelectric dam. So that's one way of experiencing an infrastructure project, right? And the infrastructure project's a dam. And the idea of the dam, which is, so I was reading about the Tennessee Valley Authority, actually of all places here in Cape Town yesterday. I'm reading a book about FDR. And so 26 years later, and I studied a little bit about the TVA, as it was called, when I was writing my first book about that part of Haiti. But the purpose of that infrastructure project in the Tennessee Valley was a poverty alleviation project for and to generate cheaper power in Alabama and Tennessee and the American Southeast. And that was the stated purpose of that dam, the Peligre Dam. It was to control the floodwaters downriver and later to generate electrical power. Now, remember what happened in Haiti last year, so this is 26 years later. It was terrible floods. 4 hurricanes hit Haiti. And in some of the areas where we've worked, the real problem was flood control with the dams. So 26 years later, I'm thinking, wow, it's still very important to have flood control if people in these floodplains are going to be protected. And guess what Haiti needs more of? Electrical power. So I'm only saying all this because I'm not against hydroelectric dams. But when I was 23, I got to see what poor planning of a development project meant to poor people. So it was poorly planned in terms of what would happen to the people in the flooded valley. And they're the ones who introduced me to the people living there. They were the ones who were talking to me about what this development project meant for them. So I don't mean to belabor the point, but someone asked me once, "You have something against dams?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And it's just that the first look that I had as a young American at a big infrastructure project was through the eyes of the people who'd lost their land. And I think that's a very valuable way to look at a major infrastructure project, through the eyes of the people whose lives are disrupted. Now, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and I don't want to sound pedantic or like a professor, but a lot of people were displaced by that project too. But it led to rural electrification and lots of good things for poor people. So, and I think people looking back at the TVA, there's always going to be critics of any major project, but I think it probably was a net positive for development in the 30s and 40s and beyond. And whether or not we can say that about the dam that you're talking about, I'm not so sure, but we still need better flood control and more electrical power in Haiti. So when you are a peasant farmer, and that's a term used in Haiti, for people who are working the land. And you lose your land, then you lose the means of supporting your family, and that's very destructive, right? I mean, to go from being able to work to support your family to being a squatter, a landless peasant, is a terrible and destructive thing. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Now, the question with a lot of these projects is are there ways of bringing benefits like electricity, flood control, water, to large numbers of people without disrupting them? I'm sure the answer to that must be yes. And whether or not that was done there is still an open question. I think it wasn't. Now, talking about human ecosystems, don't forget that, Haiti is in many ways was created, it's an artificial creation. And the people who call themselves Haitians were kidnapped in West Africa and dragged over across the Atlantic in chains. The natives of that country disappeared, before the 17th, 18th century. So the ecosystem in Haiti has always been disrupted, as is true in a lot of the Caribbean. And so I'm not sure exactly how to use that term effectively there. By the time that the valley that I lived in was flooded, it was also a creation after the Haitian Revolution. People fled up into the hills and they worked the land themselves, so were creating a new ecosystem, in a sense, what you call a human ecosystem. And that was disrupted again by this flooding of the valley. I think the answer to that for me is no, I don't feel that way. I mean, and again, going back to the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, I may get the numbers wrong, but something along these lines. Yes, 15,000 people were displaced. I'm sure it wasn't done well. But think how many millions of people got electrical power, cheap electrical power compared to what was available before from private utility companies. So, I think, and I would like to look back at what I wrote when I was in my 20s, writing about, even about TVA in my PhD thesis, for example. And I'd like to look back at it. I will look back at it now that you bring it up, because I'm not so sure I was that fair to the TVA. And there are many other major infrastructure projects around the world that are, by the way, now very hotly contested. Now there is actually there are movements against these big infrastructure projects. I wouldn't want us to have Luddite approaches to technology and infrastructure projects. We need electricity, roads, we need green fuels. We need all those things. We need clean power. So I think we need to keep pushing forward on finding solutions to these technological problems, but we need them to be solutions that are not disruptive ecologically. We need them to be solutions that are not disruptive socially. And I also think it's fair to ask, well, how is this going to affect really poor people? So if we could do better on that front, I wouldn't be opposed to, building a dam. And I'm not even opposed to that dam. It's just that I happen to have learned about it from the people who lost their land. It's not about the dam. It's about the way that those people were treated. And I might add, and I have added many times in print, that they also did not get electricity or water. The people I knew, they had neither of those things. So it's a hydroelectric dam, and you'd think that the people who lost their land would at least get hydro and electric, and they didn't. It took decades for them to get electricity. They were poor. That's why. They were poor. They didn't have much of a voice. The electricity was going off to the city, and they didn't have the power to get the power. Now, again, I think it'd be it's good for me to read about the TVA again now, 26 years later. As I was saying, I was just doing that here. And to look at other perspectives on what can be done with decent, well-thought-out infrastructure that's actually designed to help poor people. So we can do that. Haiti's been my best teacher, and I remain, if I go, in 2005, I went to Rwanda, and along with other people at Partners in Health, there are projects in Malawi and Lesotho and with a partner institution in Burundi. So from 2005 to now, I've spent most of my time, field time in Africa. But if I hadn't learned those lessons and we hadn't learned those lessons in Haiti, then how would we know really what to do in rural Africa? Because those are not culturally similar places, but they're structurally similar. So there's no cultural or linguistic tie between Haiti and Rwanda, but they're very poor agrarian societies, much disrupted by political violence, and with a history of heavy post-colonial burdens. So there are very significant structural similarities between those places. So, of course, one hopes that the lessons learned in Haiti would be, I guess the word is transferable, and most of them are. So Haiti's been my best teacher in that sense. But I wouldn't want teachers at Duke and Harvard to think that I was saying that I didn't have the book knowledge that I need. I got that in Haiti. I really got that in the universities. But understanding its strengths and limitations of book knowledge, if I can, or analysis in general, you learn that in a place like Haiti. You find out how far that knowledge can take you and where you need to generate new knowledge. And that comes from working with lots of other people, as I've said a couple times. It doesn't come from oneself and books. It comes from experience, learning to listen to other people, working with big teams of people. I think part of it was that I saw just how many different groups had been in and out of Haiti over the years. And I knew they were well-meaning. Even if I was, as sometimes young people are, I'm sure I was, hypercritical. That's okay, and everybody's a critic. And like I said, the diagnosis is easy and cheap to make, right? You see all this aid money going into Haiti. I'm talking about the 80s. Haiti's still in trouble. It's easy to say, gee, there's a problem here. There's a problem with the effectiveness of the aid. And there were missionary groups, and there were, short-term medical missions, and there were tons of people from the United States and Europe. So I think back then I said, well, we need to have long-term partnerships, hence the name. You can't, it's not going to be someone coming into the United States, into Haiti saying, do this, do that. It's really about partnerships. So in many senses, certainly the idea for doing that came from Haiti, but also the start was in Haiti. Initially, it wasn't in Harvard at all. I'm not sure we would have anticipated that it would fit in a research university. I wouldn't have guessed that when I was a medical student. And so I'm afraid it was quite conventional to start with. There was the notion that you needed partnership. Again, it's not rocket science. The notion that it would need to be long-term, not particularly rocket science either. The notion that you'd have to link a resource-rich setting like Boston or Harvard to a place like Central, that was obvious too, because all of us who were doing any kind of connection were living links between a world of great poverty and a world of affluence. So those things were pretty obvious, I think. And but building that into a series of institutions which would later, span all these countries in which we're working, the idea was what we need to do is build local capacity. Again, these are almost cliches now in development work. So that meant a Haitian organization, or in Rwanda, it means a Rwandan organization, or in Malawi, a Malawian organization, etc. So, and that's what we try to do. Was to say, it's not about us. It's not about our own quest for personal efficacy. And again, this is maybe a lesson that's worth sharing with people who would look at your website, is it's going to feel like it's about you and your own quest for personal efficacy or discovery of yourself, but it isn't about you. It's really about the people that you're serving. Those are hard lessons to learn because I don't think, I'm not just talking about young Americans, but I'm saying in general, young people who are achievers, who get to go to school, who could, even have a computer or electricity, it really puts, hopefully, I hope that we'll see laptops all over the world, and that poor people also have access to information technology. But right now we don't have that. We have this digital divide. So to get back to your question about the seeds of PIH, the obvious stuff, it needed to be long-term. It needed to be about partnerships. It needed to be about local capacity building. Those are still serious problems in the arena of development. Tom White is, that's another connection to business. He is a Boston businessman who, in probably 1983, gave money to a local anti-hunger charity in Boston for Haiti work. And that was right around the time when I was going back, actually, to interview at Harvard Medical School. And I went to this charity and said, we need to build a bakery in Haiti. Now, that actually was probably not a good idea, but that's okay. We meant well. It's not okay to keep doing the wrong projects, but at that point, it seemed like a good thing to do, build a bakery. And so he had given this gift anonymously, and we went and built a bakery, and that's how I met. He was the anonymous donor, and that's how I met him. And he's one of the founders of Partners in Health, and we're still working together to this day. I went there on a mission myself in the 90s, late 90s. There weren't that many people in the world who were still focused on that clinical problem of drug-resistant tuberculosis. There's a few centers in the United States, one of them in Denver. There are a few, but they're not that many. And tuberculosis is not there's not a huge burden of disease in the United States. And there hadn't, it's hard. There's a debate over how much TB there had been in Russia in the 80s, but it's clear that TB started making a comeback in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was a prison-seeded epidemic, just as we'd had in the United States in New York, for example, in the 80s. A lot of these epidemics of drug-resistant TB started in prisons or homeless shelters in the United States. The same thing happened in Russia. And, I had that particular clinical training and interest, so that's how I got involved. And how we got involved as a collective was we thought, wow, there's, again, people of goodwill here, the prison health officials, the doctors and nurses. There's a great need. Some of the tools that are needed to respond effectively are not available. Could we get them there? So all that came together, to lead us to start another Partners in Health projects there. We'd always had a globalized view of these epidemics. The question is, how much could we be effective globally? And, a lot of groups, I think, overshoot. They try to do too much, small groups. They try to say, we'll do this for the whole country or district. We didn't want to do that, ever. We still don't, as Partners in Health. So we knew that these were transnational epidemics, trans-regional, globalized epidemics. Same is true for lots of other pathogens. We knew that, but the question was, how could we be effective? And the way that we got started was working with Open Society Institute, which George Soros founded. And then the Gates Foundation, in one of their first major delivery grants, started supporting our work in Peru. And we went back and said, look, there's a very big problem in Russia as well. Do you think we could help there? And so we ended up reformulating our support for the Peru project to support Peru and Russia, to really scale it up in Russia. So yes, in a way that was an acknowledgement of what we always knew to be a globalized problem. And how could it be otherwise? It's an airborne disease, so it's going to spread globally, just like swine flu or SARS. Let me lay it out in basic terms, because it's not just about TB. It's about Staph aureus and HIV and every kind of infection. In general terms, so they're the bugs and there's us. And these are human pathogens. They're the enemy, all right? And I'm sorry I can't be completely touchy-feely about that. That's what I do in my work, these are bugs that kill humans. They're viruses, parasites, bacteria. And so, I mean, it's like, I don't have anything against dams, and I don't have anything against microorganisms unless they're pathogens to humans. That's the link here, is if dams help people, I like dams. You know, if bugs don't hurt people, I've got nothing against bugs. They're all over us and all around us. But these are pathogens that kill millions of people every year. So what's the general point? The general point is humans in the mid-20th century began to develop an arsenal of anti-infectives that could kill bacteria, parasites, and viruses. It took a long time, and it's still ongoing. But that's the basic development, is in the mid-20th century we started getting the weapons we needed to kill the bugs that were killing us. But what happens is the bugs fight back, and they develop resistance to the weapons. So let me give it, before even talking about tuberculosis, because it's very contentious. Why? Because it's airborne. That's the main reason it's contentious. But take Staph aureus. You know, everybody hears about killer staph. It's a terrible pathogen. In the mid-20th century, almost all of this staph could be killed by penicillin. Now 95% in South Africa and in the United States, all resistant to penicillin. So the bugs can't really be killed by the drugs that we developed in the mid-20th century. So we're playing catch-up. Now, that's the general issue. I mean, you look at malaria, you look at TB, you look at HIV, you look at bacteria like staph. It's a general story that the bugs are going to fight back. They're going to develop, genetic mutations that will allow them to escape the killing by the antibiotics, the anti-infectives. So it's not just about one disease or another. So the question the way you put it, which I think is the way most people ask, is the solution part of the problem? And I would say, no, that's not the problem. The problem is the way we use the solution. So go back to TB again. If we had had a way in the mid-20th century of delivering effective therapy for tuberculosis to everybody who needed it, then we would have had community health workers and all these things that we scrambled development, and I don't think we'd have the big problem we have today with drug-resistant tuberculosis, MDR-TB. So what do I hear all the time in my work is, well, we can't pay community health workers because it's not sustainable, it's too expensive. When what's really expensive is to not pay the community health workers. That's what's really going to get you in the end, to have cheap solutions for really complex problems. And, looking at, for example, in the United States, with HIV, with AIDS, if we would simply put in place good community-based care and actually pay community health workers, then we wouldn't have so much drug-resistant HIV. Same in South Africa. And what we've tried to do in our work with the so-called public sector, with the Ministry of Health in Rwanda and Haiti, is to say, no, let's do it the right way from the beginning. Let's start by making sure that people who are sick have access to care, and that it's supervised by community health workers who are living with them, in the same villages. Because what is this conventional model is the patient's sick, they go into the doctor, but there are no doctors out in rural Haiti. There are now, but I'm saying that was not a viable model. And so we actually developed a different model that turned out to be better than the standard model, because it actually delivered good community-based care that, we say free of charge to the patient. Okay, maybe that's not the right term, free of charge, because obviously someone's paying for it, right? Someone's paying the labor costs for the community health worker, the diagnostics for the lab, and the medicines. But if you don't want to see this drug resistance develop with a chronic infectious disease, then don't ask the patient to pay for it, because when they have money, they'll pay for it, and when they don't, they can't. And then the treatment gets interrupted, et cetera, et cetera. The whole chain inevitably leads towards drug resistance. I think what's happened, if this is my reading of it, and I've studied this my whole life, what's happened is, of course we wouldn't have drug-resistant disease if we didn't have antibiotics, right? I mean, we would, but they'd be naturally occurring mutations that didn't add up to much in human populations. So it is true that the challenge of antibiotics is what created drug resistance to start with and spread it through human populations. That's true. But I would say there are other causative factors here. For example, the model of care that I described, that is, you have someone who pays if they have money, they pay for the treatment. Is that the right model for public health? I don't think it is for infectious disease. In fact, I don't think it's right for a lot of things. You look at healthcare in the United States is very expensive, and part of the problem is it's very expensive to give bad medical care to poor people in a rich country. Think about that. It's expensive to give bad medical care to poor people in a rich country. We're in Cape Town, so let's just talk about Cape Town. You look at the massive teaching hospital here, or the beautiful university, but the idea that some people, because they're poor here, are not going to try and get good medical care for their family, that's absurd. Of course they are. It's women who live in poverty love their children just as much as anybody else does. So you're going to have all of this engine of really effective connections and families that are going to push people to try and get medical care. But if it's a commodity that you buy, then when you're poor, you buy it. Sometimes you can't buy it at other times. That's not a good model for public health response, I would say. So a lot of people figured this out around tuberculosis back in the 20th century. They said, oh, we made a mistake here selling these drugs. And so they took the drugs out of the pharmacies and put them in the hands of public health officials. And, I think that was the right thing to do. And that is convention, but the problem is, in the world, we don't have that system set up in enough places so that everybody who has tuberculosis, to stick with that disease, has access to diagnosis and care. Instead, they don't know what they have. They cough. They go get a chest x-ray. They pay out of pocket for that. They're told one thing. Maybe they got good advice, maybe not. But there's not, that system globally is not set up. The doctors and nurses who are delivering bad medical care aren't doing it on purpose. But if they don't have a system behind them, what can they do? In the New York Times Magazine last week, there's the last page, there's just a one-page essay in which someone who I should look at it again since I'm talking about it on tape, but it's an American woman in India somewhere, and she has had a problem with a malignancy, a cancer in the past. And she's told by her American doctors, you can go to India as long as you have some screening now and again. So she hooks up with this doctor, and he is, this cheerful fellow who really has nothing to work with. And at the end of that one-page essay, they go and visit this Indian woman who's dying of cancer, and he's saying, be of good cheer. And she said it seemed cruel, and then she said, but that's all he had was words. And that's it. The doctors and nurses who are delivering mediocre medical care are not doing it because they want to. They're doing it because they don't have the tools of the trade, the system behind them that they would need to provide good medical care. In the years that I've spent working in Haiti and Africa, which is now 25 years, in Latin America, versus, say, Harvard, I tell you, I don't think that these young professionals in Africa are any less committed, even though I would have said that 15 or 20 years ago. They're not less committed to medicine and to people's health. They just don't have the systems and tools that they need. And one of the biggest epiphanies for me in working in these different places is if you can set it up so that young African professionals, nurses and doctors and social workers and people in Haiti, et cetera, if they can actually do their work, they're happy to do it. That's one of the, people talk about the brain drain. One of the best ways to respond to the brain drain is actually give these young professionals the tools that they need to serve the poor, because they're surrounded by the poor. And, I think that's a big part of what we need to do in global health, is to make sure that we don't make the mistake, say as young Americans, I'm not young anymore, but of saying, it's all about us going in and saving the day. It was never about that. It's always about building systems and building teams and building partnerships that will last. So drug resistance is, in a way, a big challenge to the healthcare as commodity approach to healthcare, which is the sort of garden variety approach. So, healthcare is something you buy. But what if you're poor and you have an airborne disease? What if you have influenza or tuberculosis or swine flu? Who knows? Then if we don't take that as a public health problem, it's just a private problem. And then it's going to be out-of-pocket expenses, and it's not going to be the right response to these kind of problems. Same things for malaria, and on it goes. Well, sure, it's somebody's failure, right? I mean, what's the normal lifespan of the human, right? Now, it's at 80 years old, 80 years. So, yeah, I mean, well, I mean, when I say normal, I meant if you have those things that one needs, like clean water and, vaccination against vaccine-preventable illnesses and education, and you're not caught up in some dreadful conflict, why shouldn't you see grandchildren, right? And that would be, the normal course of human events if you have those things. So, you say every Haitian pediatric death is a failure, somebody's failure, usually, right? Same for in Burundi or India or, or Cincinnati or wherever. And so I don't think it's a bad thing to see failure as failure. But it's important to understand how to assess causality. This is something we've talked about a number of times. And I know in some ways it's better to keep it simple. But claims of causality are really difficult to make, and they are seldom buttressed by really sound data. So if you say, A causes B, and I don't mean to be too general when it was a specific question, then you ought to know how causality is created. For example, you look at, why, there are papers called things like, why do the poor people behave poorly? The point is, it's really to talk about causality. Why, what drives behavior, what drives, and I can't help but thinking, here we are in Southern Africa, we're talking about epidemic diseases here, but they're really caused a lot by labor migration, and people don't talk very much about labor migration. Public health people don't talk about it very much because they're not trained to talk about it. Medical people even less so because they've had even less training. But I guess what I'm saying, and this sounds so, again, kind of wonkish, is large-scale social forces determine a lot of these things, including pediatric deaths. So when I say, yeah, sure, it sounds dramatic to say every pediatric death in Haiti is a failure, but it's true. It's somewhere along the line there's a failure. If how else will we explain it? I mean, why would, if you look at it, go to a place where infant mortality is, let's say, 150 per thousand, and 150 children die in their first year of life. So there's got to be failures. So what are they? Well, they're a failure to vaccinate, they're a failure to, to make sure people have clean water, et cetera. So I think it's really a good thing to not so much assign blame, but to assess why things are failing. And then it's also a good thing to take responsibility for that. So I don't see it as my personal failing when, some kid dies in Oakland or, Okinawa. But it is a failure. And I think it's probably better to think of it as our failure, not because we're, into sackcloth and ashes, but because we're trying to fix fixable problems. So it's really an ultimately a very optimistic thing to say. It is a failure. And, I've thought a lot about this over the years, optimism and pessimism. When you say, hey, that's a failure, it's ultimately an optimistic kind of engagement because you're saying that could be fixed. But if you say it's, that's the way the world is, or that's life, or that's destiny, well, that's not so constructive in terms of having an action plan. There's another widespread misperception here is that you have to, in order to be involved in these kind of problems, you have to take certain kinds of training. That's just not true. Because as we said at the outset, we have all of this array of social problems. But let me just go back to, business majors, or for example. First of all, the problem is very often delivery, right? So let me put it in the most general terms. Do we have a vaccine for polio? Yes. Is it effective? Completely, or pretty much completely. So why do we still have polio in the world? Because we haven't gotten the delivery down. And sometimes in speaking about these problems. You can talk about discovery, development, and delivery. So discovery, something that happens in the lab, right? Often, and the polio vaccine comes from basic science research. And development, you develop a product. That can be done lots of different ways. Pharmaceutical companies develop products, for example. That's the third D, the delivery, the implementation, that is the biggest problem. And, not to single out any company, I don't really know much about companies, but, FedEx has to deliver they have to get the thing there. And I think we need to take a similar approach to global health and development, is we've got to deliver, and we have to have ways of assessing how effective we are at delivering. So I think, you mentioned business school and you mentioned business. There are clearly skill sets from the business sector or private sector that are important in public health and public good in general, like education, clean water. So I think, again, it's a very big tent approach is what we need to these problems. They're complex social problems. They have complex social answers, but we're going to have a very big tent. We're going to need those cell biologists and other basic science researchers to develop the tools. I mentioned already, we talked a little bit about tuberculosis, but one of the biggest problems with tuberculosis is we don't have diagnostics. We don't have the tools we need to diagnose the disease. We don't have a vaccine. So these are basic science questions as well. So we have to do that. And then we have to develop these tools so that they're available. But then finally, and this is what I work on in a lot of Partners in Health projects, we work on the delivery side, taking these innovations in science and public health and delivering them. No, I have not. But that's because, I work with thousands of people. And if you ever make the mistake of thinking that you're going to do something on your own, then you will learn the hard way. That's never the case. Maybe if you're a painter or a poet or an artist or a writer, but work in public health and public education and public good requires teams. So and teams have to shore each other up. People on teams have to shore each other up, and that's an important part of this work. Is you got to work, as a member of a team. Millions of people die every year of tuberculosis, or a couple million. So, as an example. So, but then there's this question, as I said earlier, about how do you assess failure? How do you understand why a treatable disease becomes so lethal? And understanding that, in my view, requires lots of talking to patients, their families, the health providers, et cetera. And some of the things that I saw in the 80s, we saw in the 80s, really, they were failures because patients died, but they allowed us to diagnose the system's problems and say, this is where we need a community health worker system. This is where we need to make sure patients have food support while they're getting these medicines, et cetera. So those are examples of tragedies that certainly lead to not just personal epiphanies, but collective epiphanies, where you say, you know what? We can do this better if we have the system fixed. And this has happened all over the world with urbanization, is stable social networks like families get disrupted, right? And isn't that what, I keep referring to South Africa because we're in it, but that's what Cry the Beloved Country is about, right? And that's happening all over the world. Is but you look in the 19th century, and there were lots of rural communities that had their own kind of stability, and those are disrupted by urbanization and industrialization, and there's a lot of social pathologies with that. Now there's humans have to ask, is it worth it to, the technological progress and advance? I guess the answer is yes. That's why people are voting with their feet and moving into cities all over the world. But there are consequences, and that's why I wrote, and we have written a lot about gender inequality and poverty and how they work together to increase risk for certain pathogens like HIV. Now I know that's a kind of longish answer, but it's not my fault. That's what it takes a long time to describe that. Actually, I got that expression from a series of articles in the Rwandan newspapers. And one of the Rwandan newspapers had a 3-part series about the charity industrial complex. And it's a blistering critique of NGOs and foreign aid, and looking how it's structured, and how there's a lot of overhead, and there's not enough local capacity building, and there's not enough coordination. So it's a critique really of NGO performance in Rwanda. And, I think they have the right to be critical of what's going on in their country. So I don't know how you found that, or I must have referred to it maybe in a talk or something, but I think it's very important for those of us involved in working with NGOs to understand the critique that is being made of our effort. So that's what the authors of that series of articles called the massive rise of NGOs in Rwanda and across Africa as the charity industrial complex. Sobering. The chief barrier is, well, let's say it's not lack of people to work, right? It's not lack of need. So because there's lots of unemployed people, right? Or underemployed people. So you can't say, well, there's no one here to work. That's not true. It's not lack of need, because there's clearly a lot of need. And I would say that it is, if we can move some of these resources out of the cities and into the rural areas, and into job creation, for example, for community health workers and community teachers, and community agricultural agents, if we could really move some of those resources out there, we'd really get a big leap forward in breaking this cycle of poverty and disease. That's what we're talking about, is a cycle of poverty and disease. People are trapped in it, right? Some people call that the poverty trap. But how do you spring that trap? How do you break that cycle? And I think job creation is a big part of it. So that may surprise you to hear that one of the things I see as the chief barriers is we're not committed enough yet to job creation in these areas. Now, initially what we've done is to create jobs in healthcare and education, right? But after, you also need jobs, generative jobs in manufacturing, and, it can't only be healthcare and education. There have to be other jobs as well. Now, I don't think that I would call, cultural skepticism will work, right? But why would there be people in Rwanda writing articles called the Charity Industrial Complex? Because they've seen lots of development assistance, but it hasn't been effective enough. If we can make that effective, then that would go a long way to easing that skepticism. This is not just I'm not saying anything original. First of all, I'm echoing and amplifying the views that I hear in Haiti and Rwanda. I've heard these critiques many times. But there's also a book, a guy named Peter Uven wrote a book called Aiding Genocide, I think is what it's called, Aiding Genocide. And it's really about the way in which the development machinery helped set the stage in part for what would happen in Rwanda in 1994. It's not the claims of causality, again, are important. He's not blaming the charity industrial complex, but he's saying this is part of the problem. So that has led to a lot of skepticism. But I'm an optimist. I think we can turn that around. We can make aid more effective and have better metrics for assessing the effectiveness of aid. And I think, that's an area that would be supported by everyone. It's not a partisan kind of problem. Everybody should want aid to be more effective. And so it's really not only, it's a quest for funding, but there's a lot of money going into aid. The question is it being used as wisely as it can? And do we have the right ways of assessing its effectiveness? I don't think we have the right ways yet. And we can certainly develop them. I think the public sector has a very big role to play. Right? We want the innovators and entrepreneurs, right? And that's part of the reason I'm speaking to you here today, is we need the young generation to be engaged, and they are engaged. They are engaged in public health and public good, much more than I saw in the 80s when I was a student. So we need that. They're the people, just in terms of the temporality, the time-wise, we're not going to be doing it. You may be, but It's going to be the people who are young now and studying this now. But they also have to find a way to engage the public sector. That is the public health sector, the public education sector. And that's not easy to do because, it's easier in a way just to be an NGO and go it on your own. But that's not going to be a long-term solution. It was a difficult time in that city. My father was a public school teacher, and he just thought the environment was tense in Alabama then, in the late '60s, early '70s, and he just decided we would, try again in Florida. So off we went. I didn't really sense too much of the trouble. I mean, I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and I just think you're sheltered by even though you're in schools and. So I didn't really, I wasn't alive to a lot of the tensions at that time, which are largely, as you know, racial tensions around the civil rights movement. But my father was in a high school, a math teacher, and it was just a difficult time for the United States, and I think he wanted to shield his kids from that kind of tumult, and so off we went to Florida, and I stayed there until I went away to college. I was very interested in science and in reading. I was kind of a nerd. I was the only, the rest of my brothers and sisters were more interested. They were nerds too. But, I just doing what kids do in elementary school. Going to school, hanging around with my brothers and sisters, spending time reading. I, did the whole sports teams. That was really not my bag though. I really liked, schoolwork and reading a lot. So those were, I got really involved in reading in 4th and 5th grade. That was really my escape and what I liked doing the most. But I was, very gregarious. You live in a big family with 8 people around all the time, and you become part of a social unit. So, and we would, since my father was a school teacher, we had, 3 months off, and so he ended up buying a bus, which initially was going to be, we were going to go off in it. He made it into a camper. It was the first one he bought was a school bus. It looked like it was a yellow school bus, and he just literally spray painted it and ripped out the seats and put in bunks. And so we would head off. We'd go to Massachusetts to see our grandparents, and my father also went back to college to study more math at the University of Vermont, so we'd head up north. And then we got a bigger and better bus, which was, one of the ironies, it was actually a bus used for screening tuberculosis. So it had an x-ray machine in the middle of it. I mean, it seems bizarre that I would later become a tuberculosis doctor, but who knew then? I was only 10 or 9 or 10. And the area where there was the x-ray machine, they took out the x-ray machine, and that's my father built bunks for the 3 boys. And then one year he just said, you know what, we're not going to go back to Birmingham. We're moving. And so we lived in the bus for years, 8 people. So you ask about solo activities, not too many when you're 8 people in 28 feet of space. I had these friends, I remember their names, the Crutchers, and they owned a bookstore in a place that's now, I went back to look for it, it was called 5 Points. It's still there, but now it's the medical area. And they had a bookstore, and they used to, I went to school with 2 of their sons who were twins, and they used to give us books. We used to be able to go hang around in the bookstore. And I remember one year, I think it was my 10th birthday, they gave me Lord of the Rings, 3 books in a row. And I just really, I really started reading a lot from the time I was 10 on. So yeah, no, it was a whole new world once you really start. And it's wonderful to see kids, like my daughter is so into reading now, my older daughter. It's just wonderful to see how that opens up universes for children, and it's really great that there's so much reading going on now. So, but that was it for me. I was my 5th grade, 10 years old. Never looked back. Always been a reader since then. I'm not sure I understand that term anymore because, I meet kids in Rwanda or Haiti or all over the world who clearly are gifted, but they might not have the chance to go to school. So, that kind of notion now has been a little bit bankrupt for me now that I see what it's like in the rest of the world with kids who don't get a chance to go to school. But I had the chance to go to school and to get books and to read, and that was great for me. And I'd like to see other children have that opportunity as well. My parents definitely encouraged all of us to enjoy school and to read. They were, after all, my father was a school teacher, and my mother would have been a school teacher if she didn't have all these kids. That's where they met. So yeah, they encouraged us. I mean, I would say I had teachers like that every year. I mentioned fifth grade because I had a school that was really, for that one year, really focused on challenging kids. We made a television show. We started learning other languages. It was great. But I actually got that all the way through, first grade on. And I think that's another thing I've come to appreciate more as a teacher myself, is how hard public school teachers work to engage 30 kids. It's not easy to do. They all feel their parents are sending them off. You got to go to school. And some of them are going to be more interested than others. So I have a deepening respect for what public school teachers do. Junior high, high school, elementary, all of it. So I got that all the way through. I may not have realized it then as it was happening, but looking back, I had lots of teachers encourage me. And I had, and I still know some of my high school teachers. But one of them, encouraged me to, she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to be a doctor. And she asked me where I wanted to go to school. And so I named all the Florida public universities, which seemed within reach financially. And she said, well, maybe you ought to apply to Duke. Maybe you'll get a scholarship. And I did both those things. I applied and, got a scholarship. So her name is Wendy Taloni, and she's still involved in public school teaching. I think she's still in Florida. So, and I saw her and was able to thank her and some of my other high school teachers last year. So I have been looking back. I realized, again, that people teaching public school go in every day and have a bunch of unruly and probably surly kids to engage. It's not easy work, and I'm full of respect for them now, where I may not have seemed that way when I was a kid. My dad was looking for a job, somewhere quiet. And, Florida, we had been there on vacations, in the bus, and we all thought it was a pretty cool place, the Everglades, for example. And so he got a job in the public school system in Hernando County, and off we went. And we went into, as one does with a bus, we went to a campground, which was supposed to be temporary, and then it wasn't temporary. When I left for college, I was still in the bus. My dad got these, they're called sealed bids. So how does the government get rid of its surplus? Like a car, say, a military vehicle or a boat. He would just look at these all the time. And I remember one year he bid on a car, which said, the stipulation was, you had to spray paint over. The side said, property of U.S. Army or something like that. I remember exactly how much he paid, $288. That was the car. And then that's how he got the boat. And so then we have a boat. It was from Jacksonville, shipped down to the Gulf Coast, and soon we moved from the bus to the boat. So let's just say it was from the time I was probably 10 until many, many years later, I never lived in a house. But living on a boat was cool. At that point, my interest in the natural world were well set, but I enjoyed it very much, being in that part of Florida. It's, very stirring countryside. It's where a bunch of freshwater estuaries meet the Gulf Coast, and it's full of all kinds of wildlife. It's just beautiful. Not the kind of place you want to stay for a long time when you're 18, but It really is very beautiful. Good place to go back to. I've already said I have a lot of respect for public school teachers. I think that it's difficult because you're trying to appeal to broad whoever shows up in the public school system. So I think at the time it might not have always felt challenging, but I think for people who are working hard and who again can focus on the academic stuff, it's plenty challenging. But then again, how many teenagers actually do that? Stay focused on the academic stuff. I didn't really very much, but I enjoyed living there and being part of the high school scene. So, and I learned a lot. And then I look back and learned about things that I didn't learn then, and maybe got started on that path in high school in Florida. There are other people who worked a lot harder, but I was lucky enough to, like I said, to get to Duke. So, and then things opened up, really very dramatically for me to go to a research university. That's when I really started, drawing on my interest in reading and not just science, but everything. So really, the whole world opened up for me at Duke. I'm very grateful. I got most of the things that I'm doing now, the kind of medicine I'm interested in. I ended up doing graduate school in anthropology. All that started for me at Duke, even getting interested in Haiti. And I started writing for the school newspaper. So when I go talk to university students, like some of the people who'll be here, when I say, look, this is a great time, this is, it sounds so like a cliche that a professor might say, this is the best years of your life, you're in this oasis of privilege, but for me that was very much the case. So I can say to them, this is a time when you really can build interest in everything from fair trade to whatever academic interests you might have. That's what happened to me at Duke. So I say that a lot to university students. Living in a big family is you learn a lot about how to, get along with other people, and especially if you're in extremely crowded circumstances. And but I can't point to any single thing. And then, as I said, I was just really lucky because I got to. It sounds bad to say I got to get out, but when you're living in a small town or a village, really, to go to a research university and kind of sort of discover the world is a really terrific process. I want to be a doctor, but you look back and say, well, why did I say that? I mean, I had no experience with doctors. I didn't really know any. And so, these days, if I'm looking at an applicant to medical school, looking at his or her statement, I just look back and kind of humbly think, well, what was my reasoning for wanting to do that? So I'm not a real harsh critic of whatever a 22-year-old might say in a medical school application, because I'm not sure I would have done a good job justifying why I wanted to do it. You can sort of grow into what you want to do. You can grow into your aspirations, I think. So looking for epiphanies, or, one of the examples that I give all the time is, I grew up in a very large family in a very small space, and I'm very close to my brothers and sisters, but one of my brothers is a pro wrestler on television. And so we had the same childhood experiences. He's now, fortunately, no longer wrestling on TV, but I'm just saying, the idea that you have some experience that makes you into who you are, I mean, that's very common explanatory device, but you can all come from one family and do very different things, and based on the same experiences. So for me, when I said I wanted to be a doctor at a very young age, it turned out I did want to be a doctor, but the reasons for doing it may have changed over time. I think that's a great question, and it's certainly an obvious question, but I don't think there's an obvious answer to it because, like I said, I come from a large family. We all shared the same experiences. We all do very different things. I do think there are. I'm not sure it's hardwired. I would have argued 20 years ago it is not hardwired. That anybody can learn to be interested in public service or service to others. You can learn it early or late. And I'm very much someone who encourages that kind of plasticity of engagement. That you could be 80 years old, you could be 20. You can still get engaged in service to other people. So I'm not sure that it's hardwired. But I think, you're conditioned. Like all of my brothers and sisters have very similar sets of expectations of the world and what we should do for other people, I think, even though we do very different things. So and is that hardwired? Is the way our parents raise us? It's all, nobody knows for sure. People make very confident claims about the ideology of a certain set of expectations. That is, you're conditioned by your environment. Yeah, but I'm not sure, now. And I've thought a lot about this looking at other people's lives. Why do they do what they do as adults? Is it there? One looks in the obvious places, childhood experiences, but I'm not sure how it works in terms of causality. But now the good news is if that's the case, then anybody can get involved in service to other people at any step along the way. Of course, as a teacher of medical students and of doctors, we want them to get involved in service to other people. That's the whole point of medicine, is to think about other people. And I'm convinced that people from all kinds of different backgrounds can do a good job at this. It is tempting to say A leads to B leads to C, but there's a downside to doing that. I guess that's what I'm saying here, is if you believe that people are hardwired to serve others or that they have to have these experiences, then that excuses everybody else from, who hasn't had any kind of experience like that from doing this, from engaging in public service. And I don't want to do that because I don't believe it. I've met kids from incredibly privileged backgrounds who've never known any personal hardship or material hardship, who nonetheless become splendid servants of other people in medicine or nursing or any one of a series of, or social work, etc., or development work. So, and they have nothing in common in terms of background. That's the good news, is anybody can do this kind of work. He's a famous anthropologist, cultural anthropologist. And I took, when I went to, I said the first time I left the country, except for Canada, was when I went to study abroad in France in 1981 in a Duke, as a Duke student, and sat in on his classes. But again, it was more just the idea of, well, here's a life of the mind, here's someone who's written lots of books, who's a teacher, maybe I could do that too. It didn't change the desire to be a physician, but it added sort of an academic discipline. Now, again, I had people, professors at Duke, who really set me on this path. And later, I would study with some anthropologists at Harvard and do my PhD under a medical anthropologist. So it was really more, not so much about the work itself or his body of work, which is really not the body of work that ended up being of most interest to me in that field of anthropology. It was the idea of being a professor and writing books. That stuck with me. Well, I think a lot of people, when they're really young and in their 20s, they are on their own quest for personal efficacy. And I understand that. It's particularly true, I think, for young Americans. I mean, that's the group I know best, obviously. But the sooner that people can discover that it's really about building teams and not about personal efficacy, I think the better, the more quickly we can move forward. I believe that. Well, I think that if I define my field as infectious disease, I'd say, well, community-based care for chronic infectious disease. Or new therapeutics are in the pipeline. If I define my field as public health, I would say strengthening health systems, right? But if I define my field more broadly as development and social progress, I would say the biggest developments are going to be bringing together a growing movement around social justice and linking that to the growing movement for environmental justice. I think once these things come together, that we're going to see, a lot of social progress in the planet. So yeah, any of those, that's all optimism for you. The most satisfying things that I've done, and I'd like to use first person plural, that we've done, have been in service of other people. And it shouldn't be a secret. A lot of people say things like that, but that's the most satisfying work. And it, as I said earlier, it's you could do all kinds of different things. I mean, think of the people you've interviewed or will be interviewing. They're clearly their areas of achievement are from all over the map. But whether you're involved in basic science or public health or justice, it's really focusing on other people is a very satisfying thing to do. That's something I would encourage anybody's children or grandchildren, is get involved in work that is of utility to other people. And it doesn't have to be your whole life. You know what I mean? I think, say for example, you're running a successful business somewhere. I'm not saying give up your successful business and go be a social worker and name the Los Angeles or Lesotho or whatever. What I'm saying is some part of everybody's life ought to be focused on on this kind of work, because it's satisfying. That's just, I think, good advice. I'm an American by birth, so I had all of all the birthrights of an American. Ability to speak my mind, the ability to write and say what I wanted, the ability to go. I never worried about, would I be able to go to high school? It never even occurred to me. That was just because I was born in the United States. It was only much later when I went to other places I said, wow, they don't even get to go to school. Now, that's an embarrassing thing to confess. I should have been able to understand that sitting right in my high school in Florida. But I didn't, you just don't know. And so, the obvious definitions, those are definitions around the privilege of being born there. But, I would just say the ability to have those basic needs met, to be able to go to school all the way through, in my case, graduate school and medical school, but just to go through high school and know that you're going to have something to eat at school, or you're going to be able to get your books. Other people don't really enjoy those. I would go ahead and call them freedom, just like FDR called it, freedom from want is the fourth freedom, is freedom from want. I do believe even someone of modest origins like me still had freedom from want. I never experienced want. You asked me earlier about my childhood, living in a bus, but that's not the same thing as living in a bus and having to run from violence or not having enough to eat. It's a very different kind of thing. So those are my sort of twin definitions of being an American, is a certain amount of protection and from vulnerability around want, and then the civil and political liberties that we have are it's terrific to be able to write what you want and say what you want, and I've done that my whole life. Did I say that? It's true. That humans, I'm getting very philosophical here, which I hope is in keeping with what you want. Humans, we have limitations, and we have limitations in terms of empathy and sympathy. And, even the most gifted empaths in the world, it's hard to imagine other people suffering. And so when it's right there in front of you, it's the most real thing in the world. I have a friend who says, if you try to take a lollipop from a 2-year-old, that lollipop's the most important thing in the world to that 2-year-old. Well, I think, you can be 50 and it's still the same challenge. For example, isn't it a failure of imagination that we can't figure out what it's like to be, a woman has no job, has a bunch of kids, doesn't have, safe housing? Shouldn't we be able to figure that out? We should. But it's not that easy to do. And, the late Susan Sontag wrote a great essay about this, which I believe is called Regarding the Pain of Others. I think it's the name of the essay. It's a little book. And, she just lays it out there, very honestly, is some emotion she calls fragile and evanescent, like pity and compassion. Others less so, like solidarity. And I'm just saying, we could take these failures of imagination, address them by trying to say, okay, this person isn't in front of me, but that doesn't make their suffering any less real. And how can we try to attenuate suffering regardless of where we are or how close we are to it? I'll give you an example that, again, is optimistic. I read somewhere that 45% of American households responded to the Asian tsunami. They have never been to, Sri Lanka probably, right? And that to me shows that if we cannot tap into that empathy and potential for solidarity, then, someone like me, then we've failed because we have been right up against that suffering. We should be sharing that. We should find ways to make that real and vivid to everyone. And that's what, I guess, I didn't know where I said that, or maybe in a talk, but, that's what I meant by that expression. Unless we can build public-private partnerships that support public health and public education, we're going to get a lot of energy going into NGOs, but not really being able to be sustainable over time. And, again, back to growing up in the United States, it's not like my parents built the school we went to as an NGO. We went to a public school. There's public water systems and public roads and public communications. Those are really important, and they're no less important in Rwanda than they are in, Florida. So finding a way to, regardless of whether you're a university, which university is an NGO, or Partners in Health is an NGO, and I go down the long list of NGOs, we need to find a way to support public health and public education. And there are lots of other public goods that we could talk about. Those are the ones I know most about. And, I would put water in there. Like, do we want to only be able to drink water out of a bottle, or do we want a public water system where you don't get sick when you drink the water? And I would say we need we need public goods. If you look back to the Depression, say the 1930s, I would say that it's hard to have an American dream if you can't get an education and you can't feed your family. And again, I learned this as an adult, not as a child, because I was shielded from those problems as a child. I didn't know that that across the world, hundreds of millions of people would never enjoy education or basic health services. I didn't know that. And so a big part of the American dream for me is, again, yes, the ability to speak one's mind and the civil and political liberties that we enjoy there, but also, making sure that there's some sort of safety net so that people just don't, hit the ground and end up in the ground. And that's a big part of the American dream, in my view, is, not having to worry if you're going to get, not have another meal to eat, or not worrying that if you lose your job, then your whole family, collapses into the poorhouse. And, that's something that's, worth fighting for. And I think that's what's going on in the United States now, is people are saying, well, if unemployment hits 10%, what do we do? Well, in the Depression, it's 25%, maybe more. And, a lot of effort had to go into addressing the needs of the most vulnerable Americans then. And that's a big part of the American dream. I think it's worth restoring, and sort of rehabilitating and talking more about that, about what was done, after the Depression, during the Depression, what was done to say, hey, people need not to be ill-clad, ill-housed, and ill-fed. And the second Bill of Rights, Roosevelt's last inaugural, if I'm not mistaken, in 1944, and he laid this all out very clearly. What did that mean, freedom from want? And he talked about, people ought to be able to get good jobs and good education and be safe. And I think that is a huge part of the American dream. And people sometimes forget. We all forget. I get vivid reminders because I go to places where there is danger and great deal of want and no sound safety net. So I get these reminders of what, privilege we have. And that's just really something that's worth, hanging on to.